Hey everyone, in this video we're going to talk about getting started with KnowledgeLake. So the first thing you'll get when you sign up for KnowledgeLake is going to be an email with a username, a password, and a URL that you go to access your KnowledgeLake environment. And throughout the span of this video, we're going to go over how to connect to Azure Active Directory to add users and groups to log in. We're going to connect to a SharePoint Online repository and configure some of those content types, edit some of those columns, and add some KnowledgeLake behaviors, which will help your users with indexing. We'll also go create a process for documents and batches to go through. And then to finish off this video, we'll create a file import job that will import documents into that process. Hopefully a good starting off point for anybody that needs to figure out what they need to do inside of KnowledgeLake when they get their new environment. So let's get started. All right, so the first thing you're going to want to do is go to your welcome email that had your tenant URL as well as your first user's credentials in it. Access that URL and type in the credentials in the username and password box on the login page. Hit sign in, and you'll be presented with the KnowledgeLake landing page. All right, so this is the KnowledgeLake landing page. Each of these app tiles is going to be something we click into to configure something or use something to add our Azure Active Directory catalog, which is what we want to do to get our users and groups. You're going to want to click the configuration app in the upper left-hand corner. All right, once we're in the configuration app, we're going to be taken to our permissions page. You'll see your only user that we've given you because you haven't set anything up yet. You'll want to hover over the configuration icon in the left-hand navigation bar and select the catalogs icon. The catalogs page is going to be where we manage our users and groups. It'll be where you manage your password policy if you're using a local catalog. Most organizations have Azure Active Directory already set up, so we're going to use Azure Active Directory to utilize the usernames and passwords that your end users are already familiar with using, so you don't have to go set them all up individually. To do that, we're going to click the Add a Catalog button at the top of the page. So in the Add a Catalog wizard, you're going to want to enter a catalog name, which is going to be how you identify this catalog later. And then you'll want to pick your catalog type, and in this scenario, we're going to use the Azure Active Directory type, and then we'll click Next Page. On the admin consent page, you'll want to click Give Admin Consent, pick a Microsoft account or log into one if you're not already, grant Microsoft permissions to access KnowledgeLake by clicking Accept, and then you'll be taken back to the same page, but you'll get an authorized message. From there, click Next Page. You'll have to authenticate one more time. Go ahead and click Grant Access, pick your account again, and then when you click OK, you'll get back to another page that says you're authenticated, and from there, you can click Next Page and save to commit your changes to your new catalog. Now that we've added our Azure Active Directory catalog, you'll be taken to the page to configure it. You'll see a Users, Groups, and Settings tab. The Users tab will let you add users individually if you clicked Add a User. That's not really the most effective way to get users into your system if you already have groups established in Azure Active Directory. So we're going to go over to the Groups tab, click Add a Group, type the name of our group, validate that it exists, and hit Save. And every user from that group will be added into KnowledgeLake as a user that's able to log in. And we'll repeat that process for any other groups that are in Azure Active Directory that we want to add to KnowledgeLake. Once you have your groups added, we'll want to set these users' permissions by group. So we'll go ahead and hover over configuration in the left-hand nav again. Go ahead and click the permissions icon. And we'll go back to that original page that we saw when we first loaded into the configuration app, but we'll actually have our users from our group added in there. And from this page, when you first get your environment, we do set a couple permissions by default. So you'll want to highlight all authenticated users at the top of the page and deselect Use this app, View Permissions, and Edit Permissions under Configuration. Otherwise, every user in your system is going to have access to the configuration app. Once we've done that, go ahead and highlight our new sales group at the bottom of the list. This will encompass all of the people in that group. And I want these guys to have access to the Index app, Scan app, the Search app, the Upload app, and then View within Search. And then I'll go ahead and hit Save at the bottom right-hand corner of the page. And permissions are now set for our sales group. And the next time that any of these users sign in, they should only see those apps on their landing page. Now that we've added some users and groups, we'll want to add a connection to SharePoint Online so we can upload documents and pull down those content types for indexing. So to do that, we'll go ahead and click on the Connections app in our landing page. We'll click Destinations up here at the top of the list of items in the Connections app. And then you'll get a page that's blank because we haven't configured anything yet. And we'll go ahead and click Add a Destination. The Add a Destination wizard should load. It'll give you the option to choose what type of destination as well as a name for your destination to identify it later. In the type box, we'll go ahead and select SharePoint Online. And then for a name, I will name this training site because that's going to be the site that I'm connecting to in this example. Once you've typed those in and selected them, click Next Page. You'll then be asked to provide the URL to your site as well as a username and password with credentials for accessing that site. Do remember that we are pulling down content types as well as using this account to upload, so that we'll need read and write permissions to your site. Once you've typed those in, go ahead and hit Next Page and you'll start syncing. Once your content types have synced, you'll be presented with folder options and file naming options. Foldering is really in SharePoint, it's so you don't hit any threshold limits for how many items are in a document library. So I'm only going to do this by a folder structure of a year and a month. So I'll go ahead and type that in. And folders can be metadata based or static values, and be sure to click Add Folder to add a subfolder. And then I'll go ahead and hit Next Page. This will take me to the file naming options. File names are a little different. You do want all of them to be unique. I know that I use my invoice and purchase order content types, and my invoice number is always going to be a unique piece of metadata. So I'm going to go ahead and type vendor-invoice number, and since that invoice number will always be different, I'll never have two files with the same name. You'll also get options for using the original file name if you're doing things like importing or using the upload app. You can keep that original PDF or TIFF or Office file name. And then also you'll get an option for what to do when a file with the same name is found. You can either error the batch and it won't upload, and you'll have to go into the monitor and fix it, or you can just overwrite any files you find. I'm not going to set either of those options right now, but I'll go ahead and hit Next Page. And then it should be complete, and go ahead and hit Save, and you will see your destination pop up in the Destinations list in the Connections app. And if we go ahead and click into Training Site, you'll see the list of content types that were pulled down from your SharePoint repository. Things in here get pulled down like wiki pages, site pages, style libraries. So I'm going to go ahead and disable the visibility of the things that I'm not going to use. This should hopefully save me from having to deal with seeing those later down the line in index panels that I don't want to see them in. And now that I've chosen what won't be seen in the index panel, I want to go in and say who can see what in the index panel. So I'm going to go ahead and hover over the connections icon in the left-hand nav and select permissions. You'll be loaded into a page that has all your content types listed again, but you should see denied all the way down the list because we don't give people permissions automatically. We have to manually assign them to people. So I'm going to go ahead and ensure that I'm on Training Site. It's my only site, so it should be selected. And then under the user group dropdown, I'm going to go ahead and find my sales group that I added earlier. And I'm going to give them access to invoice, purchase order, and just those two content types, since those are the two that my sales team would deal with. And now that those two content types are granted, any of the users that log in that are in that sales group will only see these two content types inside of the Scan app, the Upload app, Office add-ins, Index, and the Learn app. All right, so now we're connected to SharePoint Online. We've pulled down some content types. We've set the permissions for our end users for indexing. Now that we've picked what the end users can see, we're going to go ahead and configure what they actually do see in that index panel. So let's go ahead and go back over to the Destinations page and click into the Destination section that we were in previously, and go ahead and click into our SharePoint Online destination. And then from the content type list, go ahead and select a content type. I'm going to select Invoice so I can show you guys how we pull in columns and configure them. So on this page, you'll notice that I have 6 columns in this content type. 4 of them are text. Inside of SharePoint, I have my invoice date field configured as a date field, and I have my invoice amount configured as a currency column. We do support a number of SharePoint column types, and they'll pull those in automatically where you don't need to configure them. These include single line of text, multiple lines of text, number fields, currency fields, choice fields, date time fields, yes, no columns, and manage metadata. And when KnowledgeLake sees these different column types in SharePoint, it'll translate them over to one of the field styles that we have in KnowledgeLake. And our current set of field styles consist of single line of text, number fields, a date time picker, drop downs and lookup fields, multiple lines of text, currency fields, radio buttons, checkboxes, yes no fields. We also support table fields, which are not a SharePoint construct, but something that we support specifically. These field styles don't need to be set by SharePoint, though. We could take a text field and make it look and feel like a dropdown or a number field if we wanted to. So what I want to do in this example is take my vendor field and make it a dropdown with only the available vendors I have in a database that I have stored somewhere. These values can be stored in SQL Azure, SQL on-premise, SharePoint lists if you're using SharePoint Server, SharePoint Online. You can also create local lists inside of KnowledgeLake if you only have a couple items to populate in those dropdowns. In this example, I'll connect to Azure SQL because I know those values are stored in that database. To do this, we're going to have to add a SQL source. From anywhere in the product, you can hover over the connections icon on the left-hand side of the page and select sources. This will be where we have data that we can use for styles and behaviors. You'll see that your SharePoint Online site is in there because we pull down all the SharePoint lists in your site to be able to use as sources automatically when you add a SharePoint destination. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and click Add a Source. Under Source Type, I'm going to select a SQL connection. I'm going to name it. Click Next Page. And here it's going to ask me for my SQL Server address, a username and password, and then what database I want to access. So I'm going to go ahead and type all that in, click Test Connection, and so long as I get a connection successful message, I'm going to go ahead and hit Save. And you should now see your SQL source listed in our sources list. So now that I've connected to my SQL database, I'm going to hop back over to Destinations in the Connections app and go into that content type that I was in before, which is my invoice content type. And in my column list, I will find my vendor column, which is the one that I want to make a dropdown. I'm going to select the text link under the style column, and this will let me change some style options for this column. It's going to ask me a style type. For this, I want to select a dropdown. I'll click Next Page. And then I'll get some other options. You can change the friendly name, the label. You can make columns invisible or visible. You can disable them for editing. Dropdowns also have a couple options for fill-ins and how it does type ahead when somebody starts typing into it. I'm going to go ahead and leave all these as default options and hit Next Page. And then it's going to ask me what information I want populated in that dropdown. I do have a source configured, so under Source, I'm going to go ahead and hit Choose a Source. I'm going to select Invoice Data, which is that SQL source I added earlier. And then it's going to ask me what table name and column I want to associate with this dropdown. And I'm going to go ahead and select my invoice table because I know that's where that information is. And then under column, I'm going to go ahead and select my vendor name because that is the column that houses that information. Once I've selected those, I'll go ahead and hit Save. And then if we pop open the preview index panel over here on the right-hand side of the page, you'll see that my vendor field is now a dropdown and it has my available vendors in it. So for SharePoint Online, that's really all we're going to cover for styles, but please be sure to check the knowledge base for any additional field styles or configurations that you might want to do. We're going to move on to behaviors. So changing field styles is one way to make indexing easier for your indexers, but another way is using KnowledgeLake behaviors. We have a couple different categories of these. We have ones that assist you with indexing, and then we have ones that validate your data. The assisted indexing behaviors are going to do things like automatically index values based off of database values. You can narrow down specific options in dropdowns and lookup fields based on data sources as well. You could do default values for all field types. You can remove specific characters if you're doing something like OCR and maybe something's coming in that you don't want. And then the behaviors that validate data are going to validate that things are in proper date time formats, or that they're a specific character length, or they match a regular expression. And this will make sure that your indexers are entering data in the way that you need them to. So the behavior I'm going to set up for this content type is going to be automatic indexing. I know that the invoice number, invoice date, invoice amount, vendor, and PO numbers exist inside my database. And if I have the unique piece of information in all of those, which is going to be the invoice number, I can go ahead and correlate that to a row in my database, and that'll give me the other 4 columns worth of information that I can pull back automatically without having to manually type it in. So to add my automatic indexing behavior, I'm going to go ahead and expand the column information for the invoice number, and under the Behaviors tab, I'll click Add a Behavior. I'll then get a Configure a Behavior wizard. I'll go ahead and select automatic indexing from the dropdown and hit next. And then it's going to ask me to enter a behavior name, which isn't necessary unless you have multiple behaviors on a column, but it will ask for a source and a couple of fields. So under source, I'm going to go ahead and select my invoice data again, and then choose the table that I am using, which is invoice. Your key field is going to be the unique piece of information that all of your other fields are based on. So mine is going to be invoice number, and I'm going to go ahead and find the database column that's correlated with my invoice number here, which is invnum. Once you've selected that, you can add set fields, which are going to be the columns that are populated when a value is entered in your key field. So I know I have 4 of these, so I'm going to go ahead and add 4. And I'm going to go ahead and select invoice date, invoice amount, vendor, and PO number. And then in the database fields, I will select the SQL columns that are associated with these columns as well. So select inv date, inv amount, vendor name, and PO num. And then once I've selected those, I can go ahead and hit save. And our behavior is saved. And if I go over to the preview index panel over here on the right and type a couple of my values in, I'll go ahead and try 2250. I'll try 4250. 8250. And you'll see when indexing these, the only thing my indexers now need to know is the invoice number, and my database will handle the rest. And the last thing I'm going to do inside this content type is make my invoice number required. That way, if it's not filled out and it gets to an index step, the batch will stop and allow somebody to manually index it. In order to keep this video from being super long, I'm not going to go through each behavior individually. You can find more information on other behaviors and styles that KnowledgeLake offers in our documentation and knowledge base. All right, let's go ahead and get into building processes. So the next place we're going to go is the process designer to design our process that our documents are going to go through. We can do this by going back to our landing page and selecting the designer from the apps located there, or we can just hover over the left-hand side icon over here where it says designer and click that, and you'll be taken to the process designer homepage. Since we haven't configured any processes yet, you won't see any processes under your process list, but usually on the left-hand side in this gray bar, you'll see a list of any processes that you already have created. In this particular instance, I'm going to go ahead and create my scan to SharePoint process, so I'm going to click blank process in the middle of the page. Either when you open an existing process or you create a blank process, you'll be taken to the actual process design experience. You'll have your toolbox on the left-hand side of the page with all of your activities listed, and you'll have your canvas on the right side of the page where we will be configuring the order of these processes and what each activity is going to do. So as you can see, there's a lot of activities in that left-hand toolbox. Since we're doing a simple scan to SharePoint process, I really only need to do a couple things. I want to make sure my images look good. I want to make sure my documents are indexed by the time they get to upload. I want to make sure that my files are going to be converted to image-only PDFs before upload. I want to get my documents to upload to my destination. And then I'm going to keep my batches around for about 3 days inside of KnowledgeLake to make sure that if anything goes wrong, I can come back and reference them. For a list of activities and what other things they can do that are outside of this process, please reference our documentation and our knowledge base. These are things we add from version to version depending on customer needs, and the list might vary a little bit depending on when you're watching this. So since this is my scan to SharePoint process, I know I'm either going to come from a import directory where documents have been scanned physically using a scanner, or I'm going to come from the scan app where documents are also potentially coming from a physical scanner. And when things come from a physical scanner, they can have imperfections if your roller's dirty or something is a little sideways or a couple pixels off. So the first step I want to put in this process is going to be enhance your documents. I'll add that activity by selecting it in the toolbox and dragging it over to my anchor point on my canvas. And then I'll double click the activity to load the configuration wizard. I'll go ahead and hit next page on the welcome page. That's just going to kind of explain what the activity does. I do want to enable despeckle, so I'm going to hit enable despeckle. And I'm going to set this to a less setting for sensitivity and hit next. Edge cleanup. I want to clean up my borders, but there's no expectation that I'm going to have any hole punches, so I'm just going to leave that as do not remove hole punches. I do not need to rotate my pages. I don't want to remove blank pages. I'll go ahead and make sure deskew my pages is selected just in case something comes in a little off for my scanner. And then my cropping settings, those are really only for things like receipts. I'm going to leave the setting do not crop my pages on, and I'll hit save settings. and enhance your documents as configured. The next step I'm going to put in this process, and one that I recommend is in every process just as a good practice, is index your documents. This is going to validate metadata to say if required fields aren't filled out or dates aren't in the right format. It's going to stop batches at this step so somebody can manually fix them, or if all of your information is correct, it can pass this batch through to the next step. All right, same procedure as before. Drag index your documents onto the anchor point on your canvas, double click it, click next page on your welcome page, and you'll see the settings for what batches should stop. If you keep all documents selected, every batch that touches this step will stop for manual indexing, which is usually not what you want. I want to select incomplete properties. This is going to stop anything where your data isn't correct. I'm going to go ahead and hit next page. And the assign your indexing page is going to be who you want to see these batches in the index app. So when something stops here, what group or users do you want to have access to this batch? So I'm going to add my sales group since I'm doing my accounts payable process. And hit next page. And then under preload your documents, these are going to be the settings where we generate your thumbnails for index. So if you're using something high resolution, it can be really big and slow to load in the viewer. We go create smaller images for your users where they can still get information off of there, but maybe don't have the wait time of having one of those larger image files. I'm going to go ahead and hit save settings, and index your documents is now configured. So the last few activities I need to add to this process before it's done are pretty quick to configure. But the next thing I'm going to want to do is convert my file to a final file format that it will be uploaded to SharePoint as. So I'm going to choose image only PDF. So I'm going to drag this convert to image step over from the toolbox to the canvas, double click it, hit next page, select image only PDF and click save settings. It's a pretty quick activity to configure. That guy's done. And from there, really all I need to do is upload, and then I'm going to archive these for a little bit. So I'm going to scroll down, drag my upload to destination activity over to the canvas. It doesn't have any settings, so you don't need to double click this one. It knows either by the content type selected in index or its scan time what repository and libraries and folders it belongs in. And then my last activity is going to be clean up your cache because I want to keep my batches in KnowledgeLake for a couple days. Just in case anything's wrong, I can go back into the monitor and find them. So I'm going to drag clean up your cache over to an anchor point, double click it, hit next page. And then I'm going to select archive batches and I'm going to keep them for 3 days. Then this just means once it's uploaded and it's done processing, it's going to stick around in the system for 3 days before we clear it out of the monitor and you don't have access to it anymore, but it should still be in your repository. I'm going to click save settings and my process is configured and is just ready to be saved. To save my process, I'm just going to go ahead and click the save button up here at the top next to new process 1. And it's going to ask me to name my process. This is obviously just to find it later. So I'm going to call this accounts payable since I'm working primarily with invoices and purchase orders. And then I'm going to select the 2 content types that I associate with this process and move them over to the included box. This is going to say that anything that comes from upload or scan that is designated as these content types will get routed to this process automatically. I'll go ahead and hit save settings, and my process is saved and ready to go. So the final thing I want to do is to set up an import job so my users can scan into a folder, and then that folder is monitored by KnowledgeLake, and it'll go vacuum up all those documents and send them to the process that I just built. But in order to contact local systems, such as SQL on-premise or SharePoint on-premise, and in this case, a network file share, we have to have a method for which KnowledgeLake can use to communicate with on-premise machines. And our mechanism for doing that is called a KnowledgeLake gateway. So to configure a gateway, I'm going to hop back over to that connections app we were in earlier, and I'm going to select gateways on that main page with those 5 options. And from here, you'll see I obviously have no gateways installed because we haven't installed one yet. And I'm going to go ahead and click add a gateway. This is going to load our gateway wizard. You're going to want to name this something you can find later. So this is going to be network file share. I'm going to click next page. And from here, you'll see an access token that you're only going to see when you were in this wizard this first time. I'm going to click copy token to clipboard so I can have this when I run the gateway installer. And then I'm going to click download gateway service installer. So this is going to download the gateway installer. If you're connecting to SharePoint server, you're going to want to install this on your SharePoint server. Same with SQL server. Since we're using it for a network file share, I really just need it on a machine that has access to the UNC path that I'll be accessing. So once I've placed that file on my desired machine, I'll double click it to launch the install wizard. I'll click next through the welcome page. I'll choose my default install directory. So in the gateway token field, we're going to want to paste the value that we just copied out of the wizard in KnowledgeLake. And then the service account and password that you need will need access to the UNC path that you are accessing. And then I'm going to click install. The wizard will install the gateway service. And then I'll click finish to close the wizard. And then I'll also click finish in the KnowledgeLake wizard to add it to KnowledgeLake. Now, if I check my gateways page, I should see a gateway that is online, and you can also check your Windows services to see if the KnowledgeLake gateway service is running. So there's one more thing we have to do to be able to configure a file import, which is to configure a file import source, which is going to tell that gateway what directory we want to look at. So from our gateways page, I'll hover over the connections icon on the left and go to sources again. And I'll hit add a source. And then you'll see now that we have a gateway, the use gateway toggle switch is there. We'll want to hit that to yes and make sure that our gateway is selected. And under source type, I want to hit file system as my selection. I'll go ahead and name this network file share again and hit next page. And then I'm going to define a UNC path, and that's going to be the location that my import job is looking for files to pick up. An archive path is going to be when something imports, if you want to keep those files around for a little bit and not delete them, that'll be the directory that those go to. It'll also ask you if you want to overwrite any duplicate files in the archive location if you import the same file twice, or if you want this job to be able to delete files or just keep them in the folder. Once you've entered all of this information, go ahead and hit test connection and make sure you get a successful message and hit save, and you'll see your new source added to the sources page. All right, and finally, we're going to go ahead and configure our job by hovering over the Jobs app on the left-hand side of the page. It's going to be this little calendar with a clock in front of it. I'm going to select Import Jobs because that's the type of job I want to configure, and I'll click Add an Import Job. I'll want to name it up here at the top. You'll want to leave it enabled for it to run. Under Job Template, we'll want to select File Import, and under Import Directory, you'll see the file system source that we just created. It'll ask if you want to include subfolders. It'll ask you what order you want to import things in. And then the file name search pattern, this is going to be if you have files with certain naming conventions. If you have the word invoice, you could do a regular expression that looked for anything that started with the word invoice and ignored anything else. If you hit the drop down, you'll also see different file types you can pick up and ignore others. Under batch settings, this is going to be how it picks up files. So ignore files is there so the import job doesn't pick up files as they're being scanned. File grouping, document size, and batch size are just there to manage the size of your batches. So if you're doing a large import, you don't end up with 10,000 documents in one batch and it takes forever to process. Under destination, I'm going to go ahead and choose the process that we configured earlier, accounts payable. I don't really need to do anything with archive folder name. And under schedule, I'm going to leave it on the default, which is business hours, which will run Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, every 10 minutes. And I'll go ahead and hit save down here at the bottom. So files that come from this file import job are not going to have any metadata attached to them. If you wanted to import a CSV or an XML file that also contains your metadata with your files, you could configure a CSV or XML import. But so far, we're done with our file import and ready to start processing batches. So now, whether your users are uploading from the Scan app, from the Upload app, or dropping files in a file import, you'll see these batches go into our accounts payable process. And if we hop over into the monitor, you'll see that 2 batches are in archive. They went straight through index because they already had their metadata from the upload in the Scan app. And because they were able to get through that index step, they are now uploaded to our SharePoint Online destination we set up earlier. And the batch that I imported that did not have metadata is sitting in Index Your Documents waiting for somebody to index them. So this video covered a very small amount of what KnowledgeLake can do, but now you should know the basics on setting up users and groups, processes, destinations, sources, installing a gateway, and hopefully it's a good stepping off point for anybody looking to do larger implementations. Thank you for watching this video, and we'll see you next time.